All right, let's look at chapter 5. So this is the historical development of American education. So we're looking at after the United States was formed and colonial periods and the change since then. So we have 7 objectives. I didn't shorten them this time. And so we see a lot of key names that we've probably heard before and then try to look through the lens of how we, what's teaching today. So during the colonial period, we had Native Americans, right? They were the ones that lived in America first. And we had dual track system, and we had something called the Latin grammar schools. So we had different colonies. We had the New England colonies. And so some of their key features were they believed in child depravity, right? Where the children have embedded kind of misbehaviors or sins that had to be taught out of them. And so there was actually this policy, the old deluder Satan policy. And so they had to teach reading and writing. And so there was reading and writing teachers, there was Latin teachers, so that people could study the Bible to kind of inform themselves and not be fooled by Satan. There were town schools. And so we have like an example of a primitive New England school in the image. And then we had the development of Latin grammar school. So this was one of the best examples, or actually one of the most notable examples, I don't know if best, but Harvard College. So that was the liberal arts college. The idea, in order to be educated and able to fight off the old deluder Satan, that you had to have a liberal arts background. Middle Atlantic colonies. So these, some of the main kind of school systems they had were the Dutch parochial schools. New York still based off of those. We had the Quaker schools. And then in the southern colonies, there was a slave system and the poor farmers who did not benefit from any kind of school system. They may have had kind of forced school system on them, but there wasn't a structure for higher learning for them. So early national period, there was some developments that kind of took away or moved forward from those colonial periods. And we had the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution developed, we had land grants, and then we had some early proposals for what this education system should look like, either statewide or nationwide. So let's look at some of the proposals. One was by Benjamin Franklin. His was the Academy. And so this is kind of what we're basing, or what secondary school was based on. So private secondary schools, right? Public elementary, but private secondary. So only certain people could go to the private schools. And they were taught English, a second language, math, and sciences in these secondary schools. So this would be like equivalent to our high school. And then there was Jefferson, who believed people should be educated in order to be a better citizen. His was not passed, but he had we do have the separation of church and state. He was a great proponent of that. And then the state-funded public schools, he said that the state should fund public schooling for 3 years. He thought it should be free for children, both boys and girls, to attend elementary. And then secondary education, he said, should only be available to boys, but there should be a merit scholarship. So if poor boys wanted to go, there should be some kind of scholarship for them. This was not passed. Then there was Benjamin Rush, who believed in church-related schools. So he believed that there should be charter schools. And those charter schools should be able to teach the nation's Christian roots. So similar to Jefferson, where Jefferson believed in the church and he believed in the state, but he kept them separate. The difference for Benjamin Rush was he believed in the church, he believed in the state, but he wanted to allow people to combine them if they felt, if their town wanted to combine them. Or if the charter school, if a certain community wanted to combine them. He also thought that men and women were intellectually equal and that college should be for women as well. So he was a proponent of college for women. Whereas we can see, Jefferson, only boys should be beyond elementary school educated. Then we have Webster. So he thought there should be a language for the United States separate from what the European English was. So there was American English. He developed the dictionary. You probably know him from the Merriam-Webster, right? The dictionary, he thought the English language for America should be separate from the English language that was used in Europe. So here we come to the monitorial method. So the monitorial method has it in its title. These are monitors. So there would be one master teacher, large number of students, hundreds or so forth, and they would train monitors. So this is similar to like teaching assistants in large schools. There was the common school. So these were publicly supported but locally controlled elementaries. The typical start of the day would include a prayer, a pledge of allegiance, and some kind of patriotic passage or some kind of hymn or Christian passage. And slaves were excluded from these school systems until after the Civil War. So after the Civil War, slaves were allowed to enter these school systems, or actually they weren't slaves anymore, former slaves. And they allowed residents to organize local schools and vote after the Civil War. They were encouraged to establish elected school boards and levy taxes to fund these schools. And so some of them mandated the establishment of these districts to collect the taxes and establish the elections. Horace Mann, he was one of the biggest proponents for the educational ladder, we kind of already saw it coming from the previous advisors and kind of proponents. But we have the elementary school, so younger age. Then we have the secondary for our equivalent of junior high school. And then there was the college. So that is the educational ladder. We still use it today. A lot of nations do. And Horace Mann believed that education was necessary for a democratic society. And so you'll notice the words Democrat and Republic throughout this course. These are not referring to the typical political parties that you're thinking of, or that you may be thinking of, right? So just be cognizant of that. It's not referring to the political parties. It's referring to the theories behind that, right? Democratic society, everyone gets to vote. The Republic, everyone gets to vote, and you have the leaders that make the decisions. And there's more nuances to that. It's not a political science class, but it does go into needing to know those informations. So let's see. Horace Mann did believe in one American culture. So similar to Webster, needing to develop that culture. Webster was for the language. Mann was kind of expanding that to a full culture. And we had the development of women's education. Remember, we had people that actually thought women could go to college. I laugh because I'm a woman teaching college. Yeah. All right. So we have the normal school. We had teacher preparation, and these teacher preparations were the first career paths for women. And so women were allowed to go to college, and for the most part, they were developed into teachers. And we had Catherine Beecher, who, took on this role, and we can see the one-room schoolhouse. I know some small rural communities still have something similar to this. A direct democracy where people were elected to the school board. And then, but a problem was the teacher certification. So different districts would decide for themselves what a qualified teacher was. And within a state, we don't have that anymore so much. But between states, that sometimes still exists. So if you're planning to teach in different states, you'll want to look at each state's certification requirements. Here's an image of an example of a one-room schoolhouse. Literally one room. All the kids from the community would go to that one room to get education from the traditional female teacher. And you'll even see today elementary schools are typically taught by females. So that gender role has continued. There were the McGuffrey readers, and so these were the readers that were used in many schools at the time. It focused on some key aspects. Literacy was one of the biggest things that communities wanted to focus on, make sure we have literate citizens, literate people in their communities. They reinforced hard work, diligence, punctuality, so making sure people got to school on time, patriotism, right? We said that we had that Pledge of Allegiance every morning, and civility, so there were certain manners or mannerisms that were encouraged or required. So we saw a lot of people mentioning the secondary system. It kept developing over time. And the academy was one of the forerunners for our modern high school. Remember the academy I talked about earlier. So Benjamin Franklin, he believed, right, the academy, traditional college prep, teach them Latin and Greek. And Latin and Greek actually are so foundational in the English language and a lot of languages. It really does help with your vocabulary. And then, right, teaching the English language. There was elementary teacher preparation and some educating of women. In the 1900s, we had some laws come into effect that required, so compulsory education required people to go to school. And that was at the same time as child labor laws were coming about. So, like, one of the great books that talks about this, Upton Sinclair's books, I won't get into that, but right, kids were made to work in factories or made to work, and by requiring students or kids to become students, it kind of combated this child labor. And so at the same time, these went hand in hand. It really helped to promote education for the youth. Urbanization, so cities started to develop, right? People started flocking to certain areas where the job opportunities were, and so one-room schoolhouses weren't cutting it anymore, right? We had to separate the elementary from the high school, and the high school had to have its own curriculum. So there was two groups, the Committee of 10 and then the Commission on the Reorganization of Secondary Education, that worked to shape what the high school curriculum would look like. High school was, and for the most part, usually still is, seen as a college prep, focusing on English, foreign language, math, all of that. It taught some commercial or business. It tried to teach industry or home ec or agriculture. So agriculture was very big. And then it did recognize that some people would end their education after high school. So it tried to teach them the final skills they would need to know before they went out into the society and become citizens. And junior high schools, and middle schools were developed because they realized between elementary and high school, there needed to be some kind of gap to prepare students for this high school, college prep, or vocational focus. So we have the development of that middle area. Technology also developed. So here's kind of a makeshift timeline. 1920s, we had the radio, motion pictures going on. People were using that in their classrooms a bit. That's what we can think of that as teaching society outside the classroom. There's television in the 1950s that also brought education to people. And then in the 70s, they used television and closed circuit TV to provide education in remote places. And of course, in the 1990s, computers, digital literacy, people saw the need for that as well. All right, so we had elementary, and then we had the secondary schools, now colleges and universities. So let's look at some contributing factors to the development of college and university. Like I mentioned earlier, we had the liberal arts colleges. So Harvard was one of them, the best known one, Harvard College. And it kind of set out the first year, second year, third year, fourth year, what everyone should learn. And so you can see Latin, Greek, Hebrew, rhetoric. So think of that as like communication skills and logic. So again, Greek, Hebrew, logic, but this time adding in philosophy, natural philosophies, mathematics, ethics, metaphysics. So thinking about what we're doing. And so a lot of structured liberal arts. And so you'll notice these are focused on languages, thinking, thought. They're not applied in the traditional sense. So land-grant colleges came about. This was in 1862, where they saw the need for applications like it's great that we're teaching people how to be teachers, but we also need to teach people careers and skills and trades. So land grant colleges came about. We had colleges and universities develop. This helped applied sciences come about, engineering, specific teacher prep schools, and then graduate research. So people could start researching new technologies. Community colleges came shortly after. So we have the 19th, early 20th centuries. These were two-year colleges. So like Bakersfield College, right? Some might call it a junior college, depending on what part of the nation you're in, this community college or a junior college. It was developed for kind of three main reasons, but here on this slide it lists two. More college prep, so some people out of high school needed more college prep, but also for vocational studies. So before, these were four-year colleges, four-year universities dedicated to teaching applied sciences, applied skills. Well, not every career needed 4 years of application. Some could take a year or 2 years or less. So community colleges filled in that gap. Another reason, kind of a boost in community colleges and started the structure, at least in California, of community college, CSU, UC, was the GI Bill. So at the end of World War II, so 1944-ish, we had the GI Bill. And we had a lot of veterans coming back from overseas. They needed to be readjusted into society, into economy. And so these were funds to pay for veterans to attend college and university. And this could be community college if they wanted to be retrained in a skill, or university if they wanted to continue their education. So let's look at immigration and education, because over all these decades, right, people have been coming in and out of the country, as we just saw with World War II. So there is cultural pluralism, and so we want to learn that term. Let's look at the changing patterns of immigration. So 1840s, we had Irish and German immigration. And so those were the people that were looked down upon. They had language restrictions, had to only take certain jobs. And then after the Civil War, it kind of changed a bit. And then we have in 1924, there was quotas on certain European countries. So that means only a certain number of people could come from Eastern or Southern Europe. And then the assimilationist ideology. So the four main tenets, according to our textbook, were to speak and read English, work hard, obey U.S. laws, and teach immigrants to be American. Which, on the surface, looks reasonable. But one of the other things about the assimilationist ideology is they were taught to completely disregard their previous culture. So that is the part of the assimilationist ideology that people fought against, right? They wanted to keep their home culture and do these things listed here. They wanted to learn English. They wanted to work in the U.S. They wanted to obey the U.S. laws. They wanted to learn how to be American, but they also wanted to keep their home culture. And so that is different, and we'll look at that in a little bit. So now we're going to look at each kind of culture, take a look at the specifics throughout the decades. And African Americans, they had the Emancipation Proclamation. So this was in 1865. Well, the Emancipation was but anyway. Okay, so the Freedmen's Bureau, was in 1865. And this was in response to the Emancipation Proclamation, the freeing of slaves, where this was a federal bureau established to help African Americans. They provide assistance to them to become freed men. Yeah. Booker T. Washington, he was in the 1880s. And so he was about showing people how to move from slavery to freedom. And then we have W.E.B. Du Bois, Du Bois, not French. He was a critic of Washington. So he thought that Washington was moving too slow. He wanted immediate flip the switch freedom. Washington thought incremental change was the way to go. And so Du Bois actually he was one of the founding members of NAACP, started in 1909. He set the stage for a lot of the civil rights movements that happened in the 1960s. Native Americans, so we mentioned them earlier in this chapter, they had an informal education, and, informal in terms of whatever our current structure is. But they had the storytelling that we were talking about in the previous chapters. They had the sharing of knowledge from the elders. They had the dance. They had the art. So they did pass on knowledge. It just wasn't in the same way as elementary, sit behind a desk, those structured, formal educations. It was an informal education. So the Europeans sought to civilize the Native Americans. They created missions to teach them how to be civil, to teach them either Catholic or Christian beliefs. We have a lot of missions in California. Probably learned about it in 3rd grade. But these, you can see from the picture, we have the Native American. And then after being civilized, air quotes, this is what he looked like. So they were forcibly relocated to reservations. They were pushed to certain parts of the country. And between the 1890s and the 1930s, there was the formation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So not even Native Americans, Indian Affairs. And these were used to assimilate Native Americans. Depending on the height of the Native American, not even the age, just the height of a Native American, they would take them away forcibly from their families and put them in boarding schools to, quote unquote, civilize them, to assimilate them to become American. It wasn't until 1975, so after the African American civil rights movements of the 1960s, where assimilation policies ended for Native Americans. So there is Native American perspective. Latin Americans. So for purposes of this, Latino is a Spanish-speaking people from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Central or South America, according to our textbook. And so we had a lot of different policies and events through that. There was the Americanization policy. So in 1848, all Mexican-American children were taught English. And you can see not a whole lot happened. It was just like Mexican Americans teach English. Then in the 1960s, there was the Chicano movement. So Chicano Mexican American. 1950s was Puerto Rico, when Puerto Rico became a U.S. Commonwealth. In the 1950s through the 1970s, so we had a lot of Cuban exiles from communist Cuba come to America because they wanted, the freedom that America provides, not the communist regime of Cuba. And then it wasn't until 1968 that the Bilingual Education Act was passed. So that means before 1968, only English was taught, only English was allowed. People, immigrants, everybody could only speak English. And a lot of immigrants were considered, unable to be educated because they didn't speak English at the time. Unfortunately, by 1998, bilingual education ended. California, again, was not allowed to teach anything other than English, and this was a big push. So it wasn't revitalized until the past 5-10 years, the movement for bilingual education again. So a lot of Latin Americans, Asian Americans we'll see next, were severely affected by these bilingual education acts. Negatively affected. Asian Americans. So Chinese Americans, in 1882, they were banned. They were not allowed to come to the U.S. If they were already here, they could not be in the same rooms as other people. And it wasn't until 1940s that they were allowed to become citizens or even own anything. And 1974 is when Chinese Americans were allowed to be educated in their language so that they can learn properly and then learn English. And so that, like I said, went hand in hand with these bilingual education movements from Latin Americans. Japanese Americans, they were also segregated. In 1941 through 1945, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, people became very suspicious of the Japanese Americans. They were forced into Japanese internment camps. So the image is of Japanese internment camps. There were some in many states. There were some in California. And so they were taught in these internment camps. And so education, they basically were not provided formal education during that time. And it was whatever they could find. In 1988, so not until the late 80s, was the Civil Liberties Act passed, and this is where there's a presidential letter of apology for the Japanese internment camps. Other Asian Americans continued to come to the U.S. Immigration in the 1960s and 70s was really one of the increasing points in Asian immigration to the U.S. Arab Americans, so for purposes of this, Arab means people whose first language is Arabic. In the 1870s, 1915s, through that time period, a lot of them came from the Turkish Ottoman Empire. So again, fleeing an empire, a place that was oppressive or violent, so they can come be free in America. And immigration continued after World War II. So there was a bit of a period between World War I and World War II where people weren't really coming in too much. But after World War II, immigration really picked up. And these are some of the people that were assimilated in public schools, but they maintained their home culture. So other groups didn't necessarily do this. Arab Americans did. They maintained their culture, their language, their customs, their religions, separate from being assimilated. So Common Core, it actually has a long history, but Reagan started with the basic education movement, kind of setting standards for what basic education would look like. Bush re-energized that idea, George W. Bush, with the No Child Left Behind. And then Obama kind of came after that with the Race to the Top and Common Core standards. So you probably know some people, some teachers, some parents, maybe even yourself, know the controversy of Common Core. And this is kind of just a quick rundown of the timeline. We'll look at it more. You have the options of researching any of these historical events, movements, for your paper. So we're in chapter 7, we're going to look at governing. This is just for future reference. Chapter 12, equal education, and then 13, the purpose of American education. So remember, you have that assignment looking at the historical figure or movement or philosophy that stood out to you. You can pick one or two of them, analyze them. How do you agree with them? How are you going to apply them in your future role as a teacher, or just your future role in general if you aren't sure about being a teacher or don't want to be a teacher? Just how are you going to apply these events or movements or philosophies in the future? And of course, you have the optional material if you want to read more about them.